Hello and welcome to the Deep Dive. I'm Adam Mueller. After instituting 25% tariffs against Canada and Mexico Tuesday, March 4th, President Donald Trump suspended the action against Mexico 2 days later. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick said the 25% tariffs on Canada would likely be suspended as well. The administration has not said anything about the status of the 20% universal tariff on China. St. Thomas economics professor Tyler Schipper joins us today to discuss the new tariffs and how this could affect our community. Thanks for coming in today.
Happy to be here.
So first off, I just want to know, how do you explain tariffs to students in your class? Like when you're giving a lecture, you're teaching them?
Yeah, so I explain tariffs as a tax. And it's a tax that if you're a U.S. company that's bringing in something from abroad, you have to pay that tariff. And the most likely outcome of that is that those same companies are either going to reduce their profits or more likely pass those on to consumers. We've seen a lot of Minnesota companies already talking about this. Best Buy has been in the news saying a lot about how if these tariffs stay in place, they're going to have to raise prices for their consumers.
So then what could the reason be for President Trump flip-flopping? Is it because of those companies talking about the raised prices?
You know, there could be potentially a lot of reasons. I think that a lot of this is about negotiations and getting the deal done. And I think maybe that's why you've seen kind of different reactions between Mexico and Canada so far. Canada and Justin Trudeau have taken maybe a more adversarial approach, announcing retaliations right away whenever these tariffs were about to be imposed or imposed. Whereas in Mexico, it's been a little bit more, we're going to wait a few days and figure out how we want to respond. And based on the president's tweet or X this morning, that it was very, it had good things to say about the president of Mexico, in that there was a relationship building there, and maybe that reflects some of the difference in negotiating tactics.
Okay, so let's back up a couple days. Could you explain what the reasons could be behind those original tariffs that he introduced on Tuesday?
Yeah. The idea behind these tariffs, or at least the big stated kind of philosophical idea, is trying to bring jobs back to the United States. That if you put up sufficiently high barriers on goods coming from outside, maybe that forces some American companies to bring jobs back here. Now, one of the tricks with this is that the Trump administration is using this in two ways. They're saying we're going to bring back jobs and we're going to raise a bunch of extra tax revenue to pay for other things that we're trying to do. The problem is you can't do both of those things simultaneously. That if your goal is to try and bring back jobs, then you want to block as many outside imports coming in, which means you get no revenue. If you want to get a bunch of revenue, you want to set tariffs just high enough so that those goods are still coming in and you actually earn that tariff revenue. So it's a little bit hard to know exactly what they're going for, but I think jobs has been the biggest thing, and the economic record on whether that happens or not, I think is highly uncertain. That at least in the short run, it probably doesn't. Longer run with an experiment on this scale, I don't think we know for certain, but I'd weigh against it simply because of how much it disrupts global trade, and there was a reason we were trading in the first place. It was good for consumers.
So is there a precedent in history that we can look to where big sweeping tariffs have gone into effect like this?
Yeah, so this is always a great question. And the answer is kind of a yes and no, because the US used to fund much more of its government with tariffs. And kind of throughout the 20th and into 21st century, tariffs have generally gone lower and lower and lower to the point they're very low in the US. But recognizing they used to be much higher, this was a mistake we made during the Great Depression, is that we applied tariffs on a bunch of trading partners, and that kind of backfired. But it's unlike what's been done in the past because the world is so much more globalized than it used to be. That trade and supply chains were much more simple in the Great Depression. I was talking to my wife who works in supply chains, and one of the things she was telling me is like, you know, you look at your cell phone, that cell phone has gone through 12 different countries. And so when we talk about disruptions like this is causing, it's hard to understand the ramifications it has everywhere down that supply chain through lots of different countries that aren't even Canada and Mexico, because of how this can change business decisions about where to import things from.
So if we haven't seen anything like this before, what predictors can you look at to maybe get a picture?
So there were some more limited tariffs put in 2018 that we can draw some things from. So one of those was steel and aluminum tariffs, and one of the things that we saw from those is it did create some limited steel jobs, in particular in the United States. But if you kind of add up how many jobs it saved versus the estimates of how much it costs consumers in more expensive cars or more expensive buildings, it ends up being a very, very expensive jobs program. So think on the order of 6 to 10 times how much a normal steelworker would make. That's how much consumers paid in aggregate to save each of those jobs. We roughly saw the same thing. There was a tariff on washing machines. And what we saw from that is in the range of a few thousand additional washing machine manufacturing jobs in the US. But what that costs consumers in terms of higher prices for washing machines, and it turns out dryers too, even though there wasn't tariffs on them, people buy them together, so we saw the price of dryers go up too, by orders much, much more that consumers paid than it was worth it in terms of those jobs. So it's not that jobs don't get created, it's just a very, very expensive way to create them, and there might be better public policy instead.
So things like aluminum, steel, if building materials are going to be affected by a tariff, how long before that trickles down and we see just rent prices jump accordingly to things like that?
This is one of the concerns. There's the National Association of Home Builders that have been warning and sending letters to the administration that this will increase building costs. They have a surprisingly low estimate of the number of imports that go into a typical house. They're saying it's around 7%. The reason I think that's an underestimate is because if you simply look at where goods are imported, it doesn't necessarily take into account that you might have aluminum gutters that are built in the US, which makes them look like a domestic thing, but they imported the aluminum from elsewhere, and hence the gutters that end up getting put on a house end up being more expensive. So you're absolutely right. Rents could be one of the places that this shows up, especially in a market where, at least on the home ownership side, we've been subject to high interest rates, and that's led to a lot of stagnation in the residential real estate market. So this is certainly a concern there as well, because a lot of building materials, including other things like cement and brick and rebar and softwood lumber from Canada, for instance, can all raise the price of homes. And in a market where homes are already expensive, anybody graduating from St. Thomas looking for a house anytime in the near future is either planning to live with mom and dad for a while to try and save up for it, or they got a really cushy job right away, because housing is expensive out there.
Yeah, you touched on this a little bit. You know, St. Thomas students were also going into the job market, and you said that this is kind of a roundabout way, an expensive way to make jobs. What are we going to see in the short term, you know, in these coming months as seniors are about to graduate? And then what are we going to see in the long term for people entering the workforce, you know, 4 or 5 years from now?
Yeah, so in the short term, the picture has changed just a little bit. The job market had been looking pretty steady, creating somewhere in the 100 to 200,000 jobs per month. But there's been kind of this disconnect between the euphoria about a Trump presidency in terms of the economy. You saw the stock market going up. You generally saw in survey data of consumers that they had optimism about the Trump presidency. In the last couple of months, you've seen that turn around a little bit. You've seen increasing consumer pessimism about some of these policies. The polling on tariffs depends a little bit on what countries you ask about. If you ask about China, there's generally more support from the American public. If you ask about Canada and Mexico, there tends to be a lot less support. And so when you combine those things, consumers make up 70% of the US economy in terms of expenditures. And when consumers start to get a little bit hesitant about what's coming, that can lead to a downturn in the short run. And so I think that is the concerning part of this. And on the business side, businesses are trying to make decisions a long ways out. And so even if these tariffs are getting turned off for another month, they're concerned about what happens next month. And that level of uncertainty affects business planning, can delay hiring in a job market where it's really static right now. We're not seeing large-scale layoffs, but we're not seeing the kind of frenetic hiring that we would have seen a couple of years ago.
Okay, you know, this next stat comes from the House State of Representatives. Minnesota has no petroleum reserves of its own, and 30% of all of the U.S.'s imports on, you know, the crude oil comes through our state. Mm-hmm. How long is it going to be before I'm filling up my car and I'm starting to go, oh, maybe I got to be a little bit more strategic how I'm filling up my car and how I'm driving?
So there is a recognition by the Trump administration that Americans equate gasoline prices with the president doing a good or bad job, okay? And that might not be fair at all, right? There are lots of external events that affect the price of gasoline that, especially in the short run, that are outside the president's control. This happens to be one that is more inside the president's control. And in recognition of that, that's why you saw kind of this caveat that energy imports from Canada are only having a tariff of 10%. And that's because they're worried about the effect on gasoline. Especially in the upper Midwest, we are particularly tied to Canadian imports of energy and gasoline in particular, where we then maybe do some of the refining. So yes, it could have a big effect. Hopefully it's not, I've seen estimates out there of 75 cents a gallon. I think that's overestimated, especially with this lower tariff. But it's one more cost, right? And in a high cost environment where people were already feeling the pinch of inflation, it's certainly something that the American public can feel and they might attribute to the president, which is not the best thing that you're going for if you promised lower prices on day one.
All right, well, thank you for the explanation, and thank you for coming today.
Happy
I
to
really
be
appreciate
here.
it. Follow along at thecrest.news and follow us on social media at The Crest News for more stories from your campus community. With Professor Tyler Schipper, I'm Adam Mueller. We'll see you next time we deep dive.